The footprints around his tent were twice the size of his own. On September 3, 2024, 28-year-old Philip Rivera embarked on the most terrifying remote camping trip of his life. He fell into a terrifying game of cat and mouse with a creature that defied explanation, leaving him questioning everything he thought he knew about what lurks in the deep wilderness. What should have been solitude would become the most frightening week he's ever witnessed. Philip had been planning this solo camping trip for months as a way to disconnect from the chaos of his demanding job as a software engineer in Seattle. He craved the kind of complete isolation that only the deepest wilderness could provide, far from cell towers, internet connections, and the constant buzz of urban life. The Olympic Peninsula had always called to him with its vast expanses of old-growth forest, rugged mountains, and pristine lakes that few people ever see. He imagined the hush of mossy trails, the cool mist rising from hidden streams, and the comfort of being utterly alone beneath a cathedral of trees. What he couldn't shake was the recurring dream he'd been having for weeks. A dream of massive eyes watching him from between ancient trees. He had no idea that something in those ancient woods had been waiting for someone exactly like him. In the days before his departure, Philip's anticipation was tinged with a strange, restless energy. He found himself double-checking his gear, running his hands over the tent fabric, and testing his headlamp in the dark of his apartment. He wondered if he was being overly cautious, but something in his gut told him this trip would be different. The city's noise faded from his mind as he pictured the deep green silence of the forest, though lately that silence seemed to whisper warnings he couldn't quite understand. His co-workers had noticed his distraction, commenting on how he seemed to be listening to something they couldn't hear. Even his morning coffee tasted different, as if his senses were already attuning themselves to something wild and untamed. As an experienced solo camper, Philip had spent years perfecting his wilderness skills and building the confidence to venture alone into places that most people would never dare to explore. He had hiked solo through the Cascades, the Rockies, and the Sierra Nevada, always returning with stories of breathtaking beauty and profound solitude. His friends often worried about his solo adventures, but Philip had always felt more at peace in the wilderness than anywhere else. Yet recently he'd begun to notice things during his hikes: broken branches at impossible heights, strange sounds that seemed to follow him just out of earshot. This time, the wilderness would teach him that peace and terror could exist in the same space. Philip, a meticulous planner by nature, had spent weeks researching his destination and preparing for every possible scenario, though he found himself inexplicably drawn to reports of unusual wildlife activity in the region. His engineering background had taught him to think systematically about problems and solutions, and he approached wilderness camping with the same methodical precision. He had studied topographic maps, weather patterns, and wildlife behavior for the region he planned to explore, noting with growing unease that several hiking forums mentioned unexplained encounters in the exact area he'd chosen. He'd prepared for everything from sudden storms to bear encounters, but he hadn't prepared for something that wasn't supposed to exist. The destination he chose was a remote section of the Olympic National Forest, accessible only by a challenging 15-mile hike through dense temperate rainforest and steep mountain terrain. The area was known among serious backpackers for its pristine beauty and complete isolation from human civilization, though Philip had noticed that online trip reports from this region were strangely sparse. No cell service, no other campers, no sounds except those made by wind, water, and wildlife. It was exactly the kind of place where someone could disappear completely from the modern world. It was also exactly the kind of place where something could watch you without ever being seen. Philip had meticulously planned his 7-day solo expedition, treating it with the same level of preparation he would bring to a complex engineering project, though he couldn't explain why he'd packed twice as much emergency food as usual. He studied every detail of the terrain, researched historical weather patterns, and carefully selected gear that would allow him to be completely self-sufficient in the remote wilderness. He packed a high-quality tent designed for extreme weather, a sleeping system rated for sub-freezing temperatures, and enough food for 10 days in case of emergency. His pack also contained water purification equipment, a first aid kit, emergency signaling devices, and a satellite communicator for true emergencies. He thought he had covered every possible contingency. He began his hike on Monday morning, September 3rd, starting from a remote trailhead that saw maybe a dozen visitors per year. The weather forecast was perfect for camping, with clear skies and mild temperatures expected throughout the week. His spirits were high as he shouldered his 40-pound pack and made his way into the forest along a trail that was barely visible and clearly saw very little maintenance. The solitude was immediate and profound, exactly what he had been seeking. He didn't notice that the forest seemed unusually quiet for such a beautiful morning. As he moved deeper into the woods, the air grew cooler and the light dimmed beneath the thick canopy. The silence was so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat, and the crunch of his boots on the mossy ground seemed almost intrusive. Occasionally, a distant woodpecker or the flutter of a jay's wings would break the hush, but the forest quickly swallowed the sound. Philip paused more than once, feeling the uncanny sensation of being watched, though he saw nothing but the endless green. The deeper he ventured, the more he noticed subtle signs that something was amiss. Spider webs broken at head height, as if something much taller had passed through recently, and an odd arrangement of fallen logs that seemed too deliberate to be natural. The hike to his chosen campsite took nearly 8 hours, significantly longer than he had estimated due to the challenging terrain, several streams crossings that required careful navigation, and frequent stops to admire the spectacular old-growth forest around him. The trail wound through cathedral-like groves of Douglas fir and western red cedar, some trees over 400 feet tall and more than 800 years old. Shafts of sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, creating an almost mystical atmosphere that made him feel like he was walking through a living cathedral. The ancient trees seemed to watch his passage with silent patience. At one point, he discovered what appeared to be a crude shelter made from branches and moss, abandoned but recent enough that the construction materials were still green and pliable. He noticed, as the afternoon wore on, that the usual signs of wildlife, deer tracks, squirrel chatter, even the distant call of a coyote, were strangely absent. The forest felt suspended, as if holding its breath. Once he thought he heard a branch snap far off the trail, but when he stopped to listen, there was only the wind. He shook off the unease, blaming his nerves and the isolation. Yet he couldn't ignore the feeling that he was walking through territory that belonged to something else, something that preferred to remain unseen, but was very much aware of his presence. The location he had selected was a small natural clearing beside a pristine alpine lake, surrounded by towering evergreens and offering stunning views of the surrounding peaks. The lake was perfectly still, reflecting the mountains like a mirror, and fed by a small waterfall that created a gentle, constant sound that would mask any other noises in the forest. It seemed like the perfect place to spend a week in complete solitude, reading, writing in his journal, and simply existing in harmony with the natural world. The clearing felt like a secret room that nature had prepared just for him. Philip set up his camp with the methodical precision that had served him well in previous solo adventures. He positioned his tent on level ground with good drainage, established a cooking area downwind from his sleeping space, and hung his food in a bear-proof container well away from his campsite. Everything was organized and secure according to wilderness best practices. As evening approached, he felt the deep satisfaction that came from being completely self-sufficient in a beautiful wild place. He had no way of knowing that his every movement was being observed from the tree line. The first night began quietly, with Philip falling asleep to the gentle sound of the waterfall and the occasional call of an owl echoing through the forest. He slept deeply, exhausted from the long hike and lulled by the profound quiet of the wilderness. When he woke on Tuesday morning, something felt different about his campsite, though it took him several minutes to identify exactly what had changed. His tent was secure and his gear appeared undisturbed at first glance, but his water bottles had been moved slightly from where he'd left them. The morning light filtering through the trees created the same magical atmosphere he had fallen in love with the day before. Most disturbing of all, his boots, which he'd left outside his tent, had been moved several feet away and positioned as if someone had been examining them. The footprints in the soft earth around his tent were unmistakably not his own. They were massive, easily twice the length of his size 10 hiking boots, with clear impressions of 5 toes and what appeared to be claw marks extending beyond each digit. The prints formed a rough circle around his campsite, as if something had walked around his tent multiple times during the night while he slept. The depth of the impressions suggested something incredibly heavy, far larger than any known animal in the region. Philip stared at the tracks for several minutes, his engineering mind trying to process what he was seeing and find a rational explanation. His first instinct was to assume the prints had been made by a bear, but the shape was all wrong. Bears left distinctive paw prints with claw marks, but these looked almost human in their basic structure, just impossibly large. The stride length between prints suggested something that walked upright on 2 legs, but the size indicated a creature that would have to be at least 8 feet tall. Philip had studied wildlife extensively in preparation for his solo camping adventures, and he knew of no animal that could have made these tracks. The rational part of his mind searched for explanations, while a deeper, more primitive part began to feel the first stirrings of genuine fear. He spent the morning examining the tracks more carefully, taking photographs and measurements with the methodical approach that his engineering background had taught him. The prints were fresh, made sometime during the night while he slept peacefully just a few feet away. The thought that something so large had been circling his tent while he was vulnerable and unaware sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the cool mountain air. He tried to convince himself that there was a rational explanation, but the evidence of his own eyes was difficult to dismiss. Using his phone's measuring app, he documented that the prints were exactly 18 inches long and 7 inches wide, with a stride length of nearly 4 feet, measurements that defied classification in any wildlife manual he'd ever studied. Tuesday passed quietly, with Philip trying to focus on the activities he had planned for his retreat. He read, wrote in his journal, and took long walks around the lake, but he found himself constantly scanning the tree line and listening for any unusual sounds. The forest seemed different now, less welcoming and more watchful. Every shadow could hide something massive. Every sound could be a footstep or breathing. The paradise he had discovered was beginning to feel more like a trap, beautiful but potentially dangerous. He tried to distract himself by fishing at the lake's edge, but the water's surface, once a mirror, now seemed to ripple with secrets. At one point, he thought he saw a dark shape move between the trees on the far shore, but when he blinked, it was gone. The air felt heavier, as if the forest itself was pressing in. He found himself glancing over his shoulder, heart pounding at the smallest sound, a pine cone falling, a distant splash, the wind shifting through the branches. During his afternoon walk, he discovered more evidence of something unusual. Trees with bark stripped away at heights no bear could reach, and what appeared to be a crude bed made from pine boughs hidden in a dense thicket. As evening approached, Philip found himself dreading the coming darkness. He had always loved the peace of wilderness nights, but now the thought of being alone and vulnerable in his tent filled him with anxiety. He built a larger campfire than usual, partly for warmth, but mostly for the psychological comfort of light and the illusion of safety it provided. The flames danced and flickered, creating moving shadows that seemed to take on ominous shapes in his peripheral vision. Every snap of burning wood made him jump. The second night was when the real terror began. Philip lay in his sleeping bag, every sense hyper-alert, listening to the sounds of the forest with an intensity he had never experienced before. Around midnight, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Heavy footsteps were moving around his campsite, slow and deliberate, circling his tent, just as the tracks had indicated something had done the night before. The footsteps were too heavy and too widely spaced to be human, but they had a rhythm and purpose that suggested intelligence rather than random animal movement. Philip lay perfectly still, barely breathing, as the footsteps continued their circuit around his tent. Whatever was out there seemed to be taking its time, pausing occasionally as if examining his campsite, or perhaps listening for sounds from inside the tent. The footsteps were accompanied by other sounds that were even more disturbing. Heavy breathing, the occasional snap of a branch, and what sounded almost like sniffing, as if the creature was trying to catch his scent. The sounds continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 or 30 minutes before gradually fading back into the forest. When morning came, Philip found fresh tracks around his tent, even larger and more clearly defined than those from the first night. This time, the creature had approached much closer to his tent, with some prints just inches from the thin nylon walls that had been his only protection. The thought that something so massive had been so close while he lay helpless in his sleeping bag was almost overwhelming. He also noticed that some of his gear had been moved or examined, though nothing was missing or damaged. Wednesday brought a new level of psychological pressure as Philip realized that whatever was stalking him was becoming bolder. The creature was no longer content to observe from a distance. It was actively investigating his presence and testing his defenses. He began to feel like prey being studied by a predator that was in no hurry to make its move. The beautiful wilderness that had promised peace and solitude had become a prison where he was trapped with something that defied rational explanation. During the day, Philip began to notice other signs of the creature's presence. Branches were broken at heights that would require something 8 or 9 feet tall to reach. Large rocks had been moved or stacked in ways that suggested incredible strength. Most disturbing of all, he occasionally caught glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision, dark shapes that seemed to melt back into the forest whenever he turned to look directly at them. He was being watched constantly, studied by something with intelligence and patience that was deeply unsettling. He tried to write in his journal, but his hand shook as he described the tracks and the sense of being watched. He wondered if he should leave, but the thought of hiking out alone, with whatever was out there possibly following him, was just as terrifying. The forest, once a sanctuary, now felt like a labyrinth with no exit. He wondered if he would ever feel safe in the woods again. The third night brought the most terrifying encounter yet. Philip had barely fallen asleep when he was awakened by a sound that made his heart race with primal fear. Something was breathing heavily just outside his tent, so close that he could hear every inhalation and exhalation through the thin fabric walls. The breathing was deep and rhythmic, coming from something with massive lung capacity. Occasionally, the breathing was interrupted by what sounded like sniffing or soft vocalizations, almost like a person trying to communicate but lacking the vocal apparatus for human speech. Philip lay frozen in terror as the breathing continued for what seemed like an eternity. He could sense the presence of something enormous just inches away from him, separated only by the fragile barrier of his tent. The creature seemed to be examining his shelter, perhaps trying to understand what he was or what he was doing in its territory. At one point, he felt the tent wall move slightly, as if something had gently touched or pressed against it. The contact was brief but unmistakable, and it took every ounce of his willpower not to scream. Thursday morning revealed the most disturbing evidence yet. The creature had not only circled his tent, but had apparently spent considerable time examining his campsite. His cooking area had been investigated, with pots and utensils moved, but not damaged. His water bottles had been picked up and set down in different positions. Most unsettling of all, his journal, which he had left on a log near the fire ring, had been moved to a different location and appeared to have been opened and examined. The idea that the creature was curious about his belongings and perhaps trying to understand his purpose was both fascinating and terrifying. By Thursday afternoon, Philip was seriously considering cutting his trip short and hiking out to safety. The constant stress of being watched and stalked was taking a severe psychological toll, and he was beginning to question his ability to handle several more days of this psychological warfare. But something kept him from leaving. Perhaps it was professional curiosity, or maybe a stubborn refusal to be driven away from a place he had worked so hard to reach. He decided to stay one more night, though he wasn't sure if it was courage or foolishness that motivated his decision. The fourth night brought the most direct encounter yet. Philip was awakened around 2 a.m. by a sound that was unmistakably vocal communication. Something was making low, rumbling sounds that had the cadence and inflection of speech, but were unlike any human language he had ever heard. The vocalizations seemed to be coming from multiple directions, as if several creatures were communicating with each other about his presence. The sounds were deep and resonant, suggesting creatures with massive vocal cords and lung capacity. As Philip listened in fascination and terror, the vocalizations seemed to move closer to his tent. He could distinguish at least 2 different voices, possibly 3, engaged in what sounded like a conversation about him. The tones varied from questioning to assertive, almost as if the creatures were debating what to do about the human intruder in their territory. The intelligence implied by this vocal exchange was perhaps more frightening than the physical presence of the creatures themselves. Friday morning brought a new development that changed everything. When Philip emerged from his tent, he found that the creatures had left him a gift. Arranged in a neat pile near his fire ring were several items that clearly didn't belong in the wilderness. Smooth river stones arranged in a perfect circle, wildflowers that had been carefully picked and arranged in a bouquet, and most remarkably, what appeared to be a crude tool made from a shaped piece of wood. The arrangement was clearly intentional, a deliberate communication from intelligent beings who wanted him to know they were aware of him and perhaps even curious about him. Philip knelt beside the offering, his breath catching as he studied the details. The stones were still damp with morning dew, and the wildflowers, purple lupine, yellow glacier lilies, and white beargrass, looked freshly picked, their petals unbruised and arranged with an aesthetic sense that suggested appreciation for beauty. The carved stick was smooth in his hands, its surface worn by something with both strength and dexterity, and showed clear evidence of deliberate shaping that could only have been done by intelligent hands. He felt a strange sense of awe, mingled with fear, as he realized he might be witnessing the first peaceful overture from a species that science insisted didn't exist. The gift changed Philip's entire perspective on his situation. These weren't mindless predators stalking prey. They were intelligent beings who were as curious about him as he was terrified of them. The realization that he was engaged in some form of first contact with an unknown species was both thrilling and overwhelming. His fear began to mix with scientific fascination as he considered the implications of what he was experiencing. He was possibly the first human to have sustained peaceful contact with creatures that science insisted didn't exist. That day, Philip moved through his routines with a new sense of purpose. He left a small offering of his own, a handful of dried fruit and a shiny metal spoon, beside the fire ring, unsure if it would be understood, but hoping it would be interpreted as a gesture of peaceful intent. He spent hours by the lake, sketching the patterns of the stones and flowers, trying to capture not just their physical appearance, but the profound significance of this moment in human history. Friday night was different from the previous encounters. The creatures still visited his campsite, but their behavior seemed less threatening and more openly curious. Philip could hear them moving around his tent, but the sounds were gentler, more exploratory than menacing. At one point, he heard what sounded like multiple creatures examining the gift they had left him, perhaps checking to see if he had noticed or appreciated their offering. The psychological dynamic had shifted from predator and prey to something more like cautious mutual observation. Saturday brought the most remarkable encounter of all. Philip was sitting by the lake, writing in his journal about his experiences when he became aware that he was no longer alone. Without making any sudden movements, he slowly looked up to see a massive figure standing at the edge of the clearing, partially concealed by the trees, but clearly visible. The creature was even larger than he had imagined, easily 8.5 feet tall, covered in dark brown hair, and built with incredible muscular mass. But what struck him most was the intelligence in its eyes as it watched him with obvious curiosity. The standoff lasted for several minutes, with Philip and the creature observing each other across the clearing. The being showed no signs of aggression, but its posture conveyed a sense of caution and readiness to disappear back into the forest at the first sign of threat. Philip could see that it was studying him just as intently as he was studying it, perhaps trying to understand what kind of creature he was and what his intentions might be. The moment felt like a bridge between two different worlds, two different forms of intelligence meeting for the first time. Eventually, the creature seemed to reach some kind of decision. It took a single step forward, still maintaining a safe distance, but clearly making a gesture of communication. Then, as silently as it had appeared, it melted back into the forest, leaving Philip alone with the knowledge that he had just experienced something that would change his understanding of the world forever. The encounter had lasted only a few minutes, but it felt like the culmination of everything that had been building throughout the week. Saturday night was peaceful for the first time since his arrival. The creatures still visited his campsite, but their presence felt protective rather than threatening. Philip slept better than he had all week, somehow sensing that he had passed some kind of test and was no longer viewed as a threat or intruder. The sounds in the forest seemed different, more welcoming, as if he had been accepted into a community he never knew existed. Sunday morning brought the end of his planned retreat, but Philip found himself reluctant to leave. The terror of the first few days had transformed into something approaching wonder as he realized he had been privileged to witness something that few humans had ever experienced. As he packed his gear and prepared for the long hike back to civilization, he found another gift waiting for him. A perfectly carved piece of wood that could only have been shaped by intelligent hands, left beside his tent as a farewell present. The hike back to the trailhead felt like a journey between two different worlds. With each step away from the remote lake, Philip felt himself returning to a reality where creatures like the ones he had encountered simply didn't exist. But the evidence was undeniable. The photographs of the tracks, the carved wooden gift, and most importantly, his own memories of looking into the eyes of something that challenged everything science thought it knew about the natural world. Philip's return to Seattle was complicated by the knowledge that he carried. How do you explain to friends and colleagues that you spent a week being stalked by creatures that aren't supposed to exist? How do you describe the terror of being watched by something massive and unknown, followed by the wonder of realizing you were engaged in first contact with an intelligent species? He found himself changed by the experience, carrying a secret that was both burden and privilege. The wooden carving sits on Philip's desk as he writes this account, a tangible reminder that the wilderness still holds mysteries that defy our understanding. He has returned to the Olympic Peninsula twice since his initial encounter, but the creatures have remained hidden, perhaps having satisfied their curiosity about the strange human visitor who spent a week in their territory. The forest keeps its secrets, but Philip knows they're out there, watching and waiting in the deep places where few humans dared to venture. What makes Philip's story particularly compelling is not just the evidence he collected, but the transformation he underwent from terror to understanding. His week in the wilderness taught him that the line between fear and wonder is often thinner than we imagine, and that some of the most profound experiences come from stepping outside our comfort zones and into the unknown. The creatures that stalked him for days ultimately gave him a gift more valuable than the wooden carving: the knowledge that our world still holds mysteries waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to venture into the wild places where anything is possible.